Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and Ash on the confessional floor, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown's Confession. Ends badly. I saw the devil kneel beside Father Brown, and he smiled. It was a Tuesday morning, and the chapel was quiet. Far too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't feel sacred, but suspicious. Cold, brittle light slipped through the stained glass windows, refracting reds like blood and blues like bruises. The pews were empty, except for a single figure. Mrs. Agnes Elmsworth, who hadn't missed a mass in 20 years. Her hands trembled around her rosary beads. She wouldn't look at the confessional booth, wouldn't even breathe in its direction, because something had happened in there last night. Something no prayer could scrub away. The wooden door of the confessional still creaked slightly, swinging half shut as if someone had only just left, or never truly had. A smell lingered in the air. Burned incense, yes, but beneath it, something sickly, sweet, like old flesh wrapped in silk. Father Brown entered the chapel with slow steps, his walking stick tapping against the stone. But this time, there was a heaviness in his movements that didn't belong to age. Something had changed. The altar boy, Thomas, rushed up with panicked eyes and whispered, "Father, they say you were in the confessional all night." Brown paused, his eyes unreadable. He didn't deny it. He didn't even speak. He simply turned and looked toward the booth, and then quietly, almost too softly to hear, he muttered, "I tried to make it right, but confession is not always forgiveness." The police arrived shortly after. The chapel was sealed off. Inspector Mallory was pale, sweating despite the cold. A man's body had been found inside the confessional. His face, smashed beyond recognition. His throat, stuffed with ash from the incense burner. And pinned to his chest, a single white envelope marked with the words, "Forgive me, Father." The name inside was a lie. The fingerprints were smudged. No one knew who the man was. But he had confessed to Father Brown, and now he was dead. Whispers spread quickly through Kembleford. Some said Father Brown had been punishing a sinner. Others believed a killer had come for him, and failed. But none of them saw what I saw that morning. When Father Brown knelt alone before the altar, his lips moving silently, his fingers twitching like they were pulling at invisible strings. It wasn't prayer, it was something else. Something that made you want to look away, yet couldn't. That night, I returned to the chapel. I don't know why. Perhaps I was looking for comfort, or perhaps I needed to see the booth again. The confessional's interior was dark, but my eyes adjusted slowly. And on the wall, scratched deep into the wood, almost clawed, I saw a phrase repeated again and again. "He knows, he knows, he knows." I turned and ran, nearly tripping, over the hem of my coat. The next morning, Father Brown gave his sermon. Calm, measured, precise, as though nothing had happened. But when he looked out over the congregation, his eyes lingered too long on a widow named Clara Wren. And she, weirdly, looked back like someone had just remembered something they'd buried. After Mass, she left her gloves behind. Black silk. Inside one of them, folded tightly, was a note. I didn't mean to find it, but I did. It read, "You heard what he said in the booth. You promised me, don't break it." I confronted Father Brown. I had to. I found him in the sacristy, polishing a chalice. The silence was unbearable. Finally he spoke. "It is one thing to hear sin, and another thing entirely, to keep it inside." I asked him directly, "Did you know the man who died?" He hesitated. Not until he opened his mouth. I pressed harder. "And what did he say?" Father Brown looked at me, and in his quiet, priestly voice, whispered, "Enough to damn 3 people, and free none." The investigation stalled. No fingerprints, no motive, no witnesses. But then, on the 3rd night after the murder, someone broke into the chapel and tried to set the confessional on fire. Only the booth burned. Everything else untouched, as though the flames had been invited. Inspector Mallory said it was arson. Father Brown said nothing, but I noticed the ashes were still warm the next morning. Too warm. Mrs. Elmsworth began acting strangely, talking to herself during Mass, scribbling odd things into her hymn book. He said her name. He confessed to more than one. The smoke is still in my lungs. One morning she collapsed during communion, muttering, "You can't hide fire behind a cross." Then came the first big reveal. A record was found in the church's old archives. A sealed ledger, never meant to be opened. Inside, names, sins, confessions, all written in Father Brown's hand, dated, ordered, neat, and one of them matched the dead man. But the sin he confessed to wasn't murder. It was something worse. Something that had already been buried beneath Kembleford Cemetery 15 years ago. A girl, a school, a fire, and 2 people who escaped blame. Clara Wren's name appeared in the same ledger. So did another. Someone still alive, someone still attending Mass every Sunday. And now, every person in the village began looking at each other with new eyes. Suspicious eyes. Father Brown didn't attend Mass that week. He stayed in the chapel alone, guarding the booth. On the 7th night, another note appeared on the altar, folded into the shape of a cross. It read, "It wasn't his sin to tell. No one knew who left it." But Father Brown's hands trembled when he read it. A storm rolled over Kembleford. Thunder cracked through the sky. The streets flooded. Power flickered. The chapel stood lit only by candlelight, and Father Brown, for the first time in 30 years, locked the doors during prayer. That's when I heard it. Through the stained glass windows, I heard voices. Inside the confessional. 2 of them. One was Father Brown. The other wasn't. The other voice was dry, rasping, familiar in a way that made your bones forget how to sit still. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. Then a thump, a breath, and a sentence I'll never forget. I confessed it because I wanted to burn with her. The next morning, the confessional was empty, but the walls inside were scorched, and Father Brown's stole, the sacred cloth he wore during confession, was gone. So was Clara Wren. No one saw her again. The case remains unsolved. Inspector Mallory refuses to speak about it. The church replaced the booth. The parish continues. But no one confesses anymore. They come, they kneel, they leave. And Father Brown, he returned to his sermons. He smiles, he gives communion. But there's something missing in his voice now. something hollow, like someone who has screamed behind wood panels for hours and never been heard. I visited him one final time, just before leaving the village. I asked him, "Did you ever find peace after that night?" He looked at me and smiled gently. Then he said, "Peace is not the same as silence, and confession is not the same as truth." I asked him finally, "Do you know who did it?" He looked toward the confessional and whispered, "Yes, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 2. Ashes Conceal a Killer's Secret. The ashes in the fireplace were still warm, and inside them, the police found a human tooth. It was supposed to be just another morning in Kembleford. Misty, grey, slow. The kind of day where the bells rang heavy and the air smelled of rain-soaked stone. But the moment Father Brown stepped into the ruined remains of the old Lanchester estate, he knew something wasn't right. The house had caught fire the night before. The fire brigade called it an accident, some spark from the study's old wiring. The villagers called it fate. But when Father Brown reached the hearth and knelt before the scorched fireplace, he didn't say a word. He simply removed his hat and whispered, "We weren't meant to find this." The body was assumed to be Mr. Giles Lanchester, the reclusive heir who hadn't been seen in nearly a month. Everyone believed he'd been caught in the blaze. But Father Brown saw through the illusion the moment he touched the soot. It clung to his fingers strangely, thick like wet ink, not the pale dust of mere wood or cloth. And then there was the smell, sweet, metallic, unmistakably wrong. By noon, the coroner had confirmed it. The tooth didn't match the remains in the upstairs bedroom. It belonged to someone else, someone much younger, someone no one even knew was missing. But the most chilling detail wasn't biological. It was what was buried with it. A small silver crucifix, warped by the fire, half melted into the ash. Father Brown's fingers trembled when he recognized it, not because of its shape, but because he'd seen it once before, around the neck of a child who was supposed to be in France, Eliza Beaumont, a quiet girl, just 13, vanished 2 years ago after her mother died and her stepfather claimed she'd run away. The official story was that she'd fled with a traveling circus. A ridiculous lie, but no one pressed further. Not in a village where people kept secrets like family heirlooms. Now suddenly, she was back, reduced to bone and ash in the Lanchester fireplace. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, reading over old prayer requests, police reports, and church records. Somewhere in those pages was the link, a thread so dark, so twisted, that it had wrapped around the village and made everyone complicit without even knowing it. And yet the truth was buried, not beneath stone, but smoke. The next morning, Clara Langdon, the Lanchester family's longtime maid, was found at the chapel's doorstep, barefoot, drenched in sweat, ash smudged across her mouth like a bruise. She collapsed before she could speak. When she awoke, her eyes refused to focus. "The girl screamed in the walls," she whispered. "She begged through the chimney. I heard her every night." No one believed her. They said she was mad with grief, that the fire had driven her hysterical. But Father Brown looked at her, hands scraped, raw, fingers splintered. The signs of someone clawing, not mourning, someone who had tried to dig. He returned to the estate alone, past the rubble, past the rooms the fire hadn't reached, and in the far corner of the cellar, hidden behind a shelf of wine bottles warped from heat, he found it, a bricked-up passage, recently sealed, still warm. He stared at the wall for what felt like hours, his breath shallow. Then, slowly, he whispered, "She wasn't burned after she died. She was burned to make sure no one heard her." When the bricks were pulled down, the stench hit them like a slap. Behind the wall, chained to a beam, was another skeleton, smaller, wrapped in scorched linens. A diary beside it, its edges charred, but the writing mostly legible. And in it, the final entry read, "He says, if I keep quiet, I'll go to heaven sooner." Father Brown didn't speak to the press. He didn't speak to the police. He only stared at the fire-blackened crucifix that now sat in an evidence bag and muttered, "Hell wears the face of protection." But the horror wasn't over. 2 nights later, someone broke into the sacristy and left a second bag of ash on the altar. Inside it, another crucifix, another tooth, and a note. She wasn't the only one. Panic took root in the village. Suddenly, every parent questioned where their children had gone years ago, even for moments. Every altar boy felt eyes on his back. Every whisper sounded like a scream. Inspector Mallory launched an investigation, but he was already 2 years too late. And then came the first big reveal. Clara Langdon disappeared from the hospital, gone without trace. Only her clothes remained, neatly folded on the bed. But pinned to the hospital pillow was a page from Eliza's diary, one that hadn't been burned, one that hadn't been found before. It read, "Clara promised to let me out. She said Father Brown would believe me if he saw the silver ash. She said I wasn't alone." Suddenly, the theory collapsed. Clara hadn't been mad. She'd known. She'd been trying to tell someone, but she was also hiding something far worse. The ashes found in the church didn't belong to Eliza, nor did they belong to Clara. The lab confirmed it. The second crucifix belonged to a boy named Philip Rawley, another child lost 2 years ago, believed to have drowned. 2 victims. Same ash, same church, same silver cross. Father Brown stood before the pulpit that Sunday, trembling. The candlelight flickered against his face. He said nothing for a long time. And then finally, "We believe that the dead are gone, but some are only waiting." In silence, in smoke. The next day, someone set fire to the chapel. The confessional burned again, just like in the first case, just like before. But this time, something was left behind in the ashes. Not a tooth, not a crucifix. Photograph of 5 children, all standing in the courtyard of the Lanchester estate, all missing, all declared dead by other means. Drowning, fever, theft, accident. And in the background, half-cropped, blurred, but unmistakably real, was a man in a cassock. Not Father Brown, not a priest, but someone dressed as one, watching. Father Brown stared at the image for hours. He traced the blurred collar. He murmured a name, one the police didn't recognize, but he did. A name that hadn't been spoken in 20 years. A man who'd once preached in a different parish. A man who'd vanished and taken his secrets with him. "I heard his voice," Father Brown whispered, "during a confession. I didn't know it then, but he spoke like someone who'd already written his own absolution." And then came the twist. The voice on the old church tapes, archived confessions Father Brown had kept for training and reflection, matched one of the children's known stepfathers, but there was no record of him ever confessing. No name, no visit, no presence. He had used a false name, sat in the booth, spoken freely, and then vanished. The church won't confirm the tapes exist. The police say there's no legal confession without identification. But Father Brown knows, he always knew. And now, one by one, the victims are being found. Not alive, but as ashes, each with a crucifix, each with something hidden, deep in the soot. A fragment, a button, a fingernail, and always, always, a symbol burned into the wood, a ring of fire, etched where no heat could have reached. Father Brown won't tell anyone what it means. Not yet. But he knows. He says he sees the truth in the smoke now. He says the fire isn't meant to destroy. It's meant to hide. And whoever lit it knew exactly what they were doing. There's one final clue, one Father Brown hasn't shared, a page from a journal he keeps hidden in the chapel floorboards, a line written in his own hand, shaking, almost unreadable. The killer confessed. But not for forgiveness, for fun. When I asked him what that meant, he looked at the crucifix above the altar and softly said, "Some souls burn slowly, but deliberately." I asked him finally, "Father, do you know who killed those children?" He closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Will you tell the truth?" He opened his eyes, wet with something between fury and sorrow. "The truth is, in the ashes, but some secrets burn deeper than bone, and they're not mine to reveal." Chapter 3. The priest saw too much. Father Gregory's eyes were burned out, but his mouth was still moving, murmuring the same name over and over again. When they found him, he was slumped in the back pew of St. Leonard's Chapel, hands folded, blood dripping silently from the corners of his eyes. No one saw who did it. No one heard a sound. The chapel door had remained locked from the inside, but someone had killed him. And whatever he'd seen before, he died. He hadn't been able to unsee it or forgive it, because scratched into the wood of the pew in front of him, carved deep with something sharp, were the words, "He saw what no priest should see." The investigation started quietly. The bishop ordered it to be handled internally. No scandal, no headlines, but word spread fast in Kembleford. Priests don't just die in locked churches, and priests certainly don't die trying to speak. That's when Father Brown was asked to help. Not officially, of course. No, one wanted his name in the records, but privately, desperately, they wanted answers, and they knew only he would understand the weight of silence that a dying priest leaves behind. Father Brown entered St. Leonard's 3 days after the body was removed. The chapel had been cleaned, of course, but not well enough. The scent of blood clung faintly to the wood beneath the lemon oil. He walked to the very spot where Gregory had died, knelt in the same pew, and closed his eyes. Then he whispered, not a prayer, but a question. "What were you looking at?" He waited. Nothing moved, but something had changed in the air. It was colder, and the stillness didn't feel holy. It felt warned. There were no obvious clues, no forced entry, no signs of struggle. But there was something Father Brown noticed that the police had not. In the pulpit, high above the pews, the Bible had been turned to a specific page, one that spoke of betrayal. And the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. But it wasn't the scripture that caught his eye, it was the corner of the page, burned slightly, singed, as though someone had held a candle too close. Deliberately, he asked to see Father Gregory's final confession logs, but they were missing. All of them. Not misplaced, erased. Even the bishop didn't know what was confessed that week. Only one page remained in the ledger. Torn. Faint ink. but readable under a magnifying lens. 4 words. 4 terrifying words. He knows about the boy. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. The wind howled through the rectory. He walked his study in silence, playing the words again and again in his mind. Who was he? Which boy? What did Gregory see? Why was it enough to kill for? The next morning, Father Brown visited Gregory's old quarters, a humble room in the vestry. But inside the wardrobe, behind the robes, hidden in a shoe, was a film canister. And inside it, developed but unmarked, were 3 photographs. A child, no more than 8, pale, dressed in a choir robe, standing in the chapel, looking up at something beyond the frame. In the second photo, the child is kneeling, and in the third, he's not there anymore, just empty floor, and what looks like, if you squint hard enough, a shadow behind the altar. But it wasn't cast by anything in the room. Father Brown knew the boy. His name was Peter Marlowe. He had gone missing. 2 weeks earlier, the police ruled it a runaway case. But now, there was no way to deny it. Father Gregory had seen something, and someone made sure he'd never say it aloud. Then came the letter, folded in half, left at the doorstep of the rectory. No envelope, just one line. You'll join him if you open your mouth. That night, Father Brown heard something in the chapel. A creaking floorboard, a breath, a whisper. He followed it to the pulpit, and there, scratched faintly into the underside of the railing, was another sentence. A child's handwriting. The man in the mask comes when the candles go out. It was then that Father Brown began to truly fear, not for himself, but for what he was about to discover. He searched Gregory's personal effects. A single box. Inside it, hidden in the lining, was a small key, engraved with a number, 314. It belonged to a locker in the church archives beneath the diocesan library. A room few entered. A room fewer still ever left feeling whole. The locker was rusted, dust-covered, locked with a second padlock someone else had added. It took 3 hours and a borrowed bolt cutter. But when it opened, what Father Brown found was worse than any confession. Files. Dozens of them. Photos, names, pages of transcribed audio, whispers, recordings of confessions dated over 10 years. But none of them from this parish. All from another, St. Brigid's in Manchester, a church, closed 6 years ago under mysterious circumstances. The priest there, Father Calhoun, had vanished without trace. Supposedly left the priesthood, but his voice was on the tapes, calm, cold, coaxing children into trusting him. And Father Gregory had them all. Father Brown returned to the chapel immediately. He knew now what Gregory had seen, what he'd been about to expose. But someone had stopped him, someone who had been in the church that night, watching, listening, waiting for the moment the final confession became a threat. Then came the first big reveal. The police uncovered new footage, grainy but damning. A figure in robes, not Gregory, shorter, thinner, entering the chapel after dark, the night Gregory died, carrying a satchel and leaving without it. The footage never showed the person's face, but the robe was unmistakable, choir white, with a faded crest from St. Brigid's. Father Brown confronted the bishop, asked him if anyone from St. Brigid's had ever transferred here, quietly. The bishop said no, but his eyes said yes, and suddenly everything felt poisoned. Every voice in the congregation a potential suspect, every handshake a threat. every whispered prayer possibly rehearsed, and Father Brown realized the killer hadn't come to silence Gregory. He'd come to watch him die, because some people don't kill out of fear. They kill out of ritual. Then, two more things happened. Nearly simultaneously, Peter Marlowe's shoes were found in the church crypt, burned, melted into the stone as if pressed by intense heat. And in the center of the ash, one fingerprint. It matched no one in the records, but Father Brown had seen it before. In a sealed file from the locker, it belonged to a man who was supposed to be dead, Father Calhoun. The final blow came with a voice. Late at night, the chapel's confessional was found open again. No one had used it for days, but inside, a tape recorder was playing, looping, Father Gregory's voice, and something else. A second voice, distorted, familiar, saying the same phrase again and again. The priest saw too much, and then it would laugh. That laugh was never identified. Father Brown never finished the investigation publicly. The files were handed to authorities, but no arrests were made, no trial was held, no closure ever offered. The chapel stands empty now, mostly, but sometimes, late at night, someone lights a candle and then blows it out. I asked Father Brown one last time, before he left Kembleford for good. Do you know who killed Father Gregory? He didn't answer. He simply looked toward the confessional, then back at me. Yes, he said, but some truths only burn when spoken. Chapter 4. Confessional Door. Never closed again. The body inside the confessional wasn't dead when it was locked, but by morning, someone had removed its heart. They said the door had never shut properly since then, that it creaked back open, slowly, every time a breeze passed through the chapel. But the strange thing was, there was never a breeze, not in that chapel, not since that night, not since the blood pooled at the base of the booth and was found dry, black, and strangely cold by the time the sun rose. And worst of all, it hadn't seeped through the floor. It had hardened, like something had sealed it from underneath. It was Thomas Elbridge, the sexton, who found the body. Not a parishioner, not a vagrant, someone local, someone known, Edith Wren, the baker's widow. She had come for confession, after hours, like she always did. Quietly, nervously. No one ever knew what she confessed. But everyone knew she left something behind each time. An offering, a token, something symbolic, a broken brooch, a torn ribbon, a coin folded in paper. But this time, she left herself, her body, slumped in the priest's side of the confessional, not the penitent's, as if she had switched places, as if the priest had never shown up or never left. When Father Brown was called to the scene, he did something strange. He didn't kneel. He didn't cross himself. He stared at the door of the booth and said only this: "This is not a death of guilt. This is a death of warning." No one understood what he meant. The police found no signs of forced entry, no bruises on her body, no poison in her blood, but the heart, gone, surgically removed, no incision, no tool marks, just gone, as if it had never been there. And there was more. The latch on the inside of the priest's side, the one that allowed it to open and close, had been snapped clean in two, as though someone had tried desperately to get out, but wasn't allowed. Rumors spread quickly. The chapel was closed. Parishioners muttered of curses, of retribution, of demons disguised as saints. But Father Brown remained silent, not because he was confused, but because he was afraid. He had heard a confession that night, and he hadn't told anyone, not the police, not the bishop, not even God, because the voice had said something that made him question whether it was human at all. "I do not seek forgiveness. I seek witness," it was whispered through the panel. Low, calm, inhumanly calm, a voice without breath, a voice that knew its words, had weight, and Father Brown had listened, frozen, silent, paralyzed not by fear, but by recognition, because the sins it described weren't just horrifying, they were familiar. They had been committed before, in this very village, but no one had ever spoken of them. No one ever would, until now. The killer, whoever or whatever it was, had returned, and it had chosen confession as its stage, its altar, its arena of exposure. Father Brown searched Edith Wren's house the next day. Not officially, just quietly, humbly. He found something strange under her bed. A shoebox. Inside, scraps of newspaper clippings. All of them about missing children. All from the last 20 years. All unsolved. And on the back of each clipping, she had written a name. Not the victims' names, but the names of people in the village. Elders, parishioners, even priests. At the bottom of the box, a final page, a hand-drawn map of the chapel, with the confessional booth circled in red, and 3 words scribbled next to it. It always chooses one. That night, Father Brown returned to the church alone. He lit a single candle, sat in the penitent's side of the booth, and waited. At midnight, the door creaked. A figure entered the priest's side, but he couldn't see who it was. And then, that voice, again, "You're not the first to hear me, but you may be the last." The next morning, the booth was empty, but Father Brown's stole, the symbol of his authority, was gone, and the confessional door would no longer stay shut. No matter how they tried, hinges replaced, wood reinforced, locks installed, the door always swung open again, always, as if something inside refused to be trapped. Then came the first big reveal. Edith Wren had been seen 2 nights before her death, in the chapel, not kneeling, not praying, digging, near the altar, alone. She had pulled up a floorboard, hid something beneath it, then sealed it again. And when they returned to search, beneath the very plank was a box, a black one, ironclad, locked. Inside, once opened, they found a diary, her diary, and it shattered everything. She had known about the confessions, not just hers, everyone's. She had transcribed them, secretly, illegally, immorally. She had recorded the voices through a hidden device installed in the booth nearly 20 years ago. She had heard things no one should have heard, sins that could blacken the soul just by proximity, and she had kept them, every whisper, every shame, every perversion, because she believed it wasn't enough to forgive. She believed it was necessary to expose. She believed that secrets were poison, and someone, something, had found out. The final entry in her journal read, "I know what he did. I saw him walk into the confessional last Tuesday, and the moment I saw his eyes, I knew the devil had borrowed skin." Father Brown didn't eat for days. He sat in the chapel, watching the booth, until one night, something appeared. Not a person, a shape, a shadow that moved when no light flickered. It didn't speak. It didn't whisper. It simply waited. And then the door creaked open and stayed open. And ever since that night, it has never closed again. Because once something listens, truly listens, to the darkness we speak aloud, it doesn't unhear it. It lingers. It learns. It feeds. I asked Father Brown just once, was it a person? He looked at me and said, it was wearing a person, but it was not one. I asked, then why use the confessional? He paused, because there, it doesn't have to ask questions. We offer the truth ourselves. I asked him if he knew who it was, who had started this, who had made Edith Wren record those voices. He nodded, slowly. I know who they are, but I can never say their name, because that would be the final confession. And he turned away from the booth and never stepped inside again. Chapter 5. Murder began with silent ashes. They thought the ashes in the sacristy were from a burnt missile, until someone noticed they were arranged in the shape of an open eye. The priest who found them screamed, not because of the ashes, but because when he touched them, they were still warm, and the air smelled not of wood or parchment, but of scorched hair and flesh. It wasn't a fire. There were no burn marks on the floor. Nothing else was singed. Just the ashes, in the shape of an eye. Open, staring, watching. It was as if someone or something had burned in silence, without heat or light, leaving only a witness behind. That morning, the chapel bells rang 4 times, though no one pulled the rope. That morning, the birds didn't sing. That morning, Father Brown stood before the altar and whispered, there's something buried in that silence, and it's listening for who will lie next. It started 3 days before that, with the disappearance of Evelyn Harker, a choir girl no older than 15. She had sung every Sunday for 2 years, always sitting on the far end of the front pew. She never missed a mass, never left early. Her voice was quiet, like snowfall, and yet when she vanished, no one could remember what she looked like. Not exactly, not even her mother. She was always there, wasn't she? The woman muttered over and over. I know she was. Father Brown was the only one who didn't forget. He remembered her humming as she polished the candelabras, her questions about Latin scripture, her fear of the confessional. It's too dark in there, she once whispered. I think I hear someone else breathing. When they found her satchel behind the chapel, it was covered in soot. No footprints, no blood, just ash. And inside the bag, a single match, unlit, wrapped in a torn piece of the church's altar cloth. No one knew what it meant until the next night, when the confessional caught fire. There were no witnesses, no sounds, but in the morning, the booth was blackened, not burned, blistered, like heat had swirled inside it, silently, violently, without touching anything around it. No damage to the church, no scorch marks on the walls. But the booth, it had melted from the inside out. The priest's seat was fused to the floor, and in the soot, faintly outlined, was the impression of 2 hands reaching up from the ground. Then the rumors began. Evelyn had been seen by 3 different people after she vanished. Each one described her differently. Different dress, different hair, different smile, but each time she was humming, and each time she asked the same question. Have you confessed yet? Father Brown grew uneasy, not because of the ghost stories, but because of the pattern. He knew the shape of guilt. He knew the weight of lies. But this was something worse. This was something that fed on silence, that burned not with flame, but with secrets. He searched the church records. He traced the dates of every unsolved fire in the village over the past 20 years. There were 6, all within 3 days of someone confessing to a particular priest. And each time, the fire left behind only one thing: Ash arranged into a symbol, a cross, a spiral, a bell, a hand, a key, and now an eye. Each symbol represented someone who had died but had never been declared guilty. Each one had confessed something too late, or not at all. He went to the bishop, told him of the pattern, the fire, the ash, the symbols, the silence, the girl. But the bishop looked at him with hollow eyes and said, "Father Brown, this church does not punish sin with fire. It buries it with stone. Let the dead stay ash." That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. He sat in the chapel alone, watching the booth. At 3:17 a.m., the door creaked open on its own, and he saw it. Just for a second, a flicker of smoke, a shape, kneeling. Then it was gone, but the seat was warm. He approached the confessional slowly, placed his hand on the wood, and whispered, "I'm listening." And the booth answered, not with words, not with breath, but with a single flake of ash that floated up, impossibly, against gravity, and settled on his cheek. The next morning, another figure was gone. Gerald Pike, retired detective, attended Mass once a year. He'd shown up the previous Sunday, unannounced, took communion, left nothing behind, except a note, folded beneath a hymnal. It read, "I found her bones under the stone angel. Tell them I burned the rest." They dug beneath the angel. In the cemetery, Evelyn wasn't there, but someone else was, a child's skeleton, wrapped in choir robes, holding a book. The book had one page written in a child's hand. "He told me to be silent or I'd burn." I didn't know he meant it. Father Brown collapsed when he read it. The first big reveal had arrived. There was more than one victim. There was more than one confession. And there was more than one fire. And someone, something, was keeping score. He returned to the booth, sat in the priest's side, lit a candle, placed the match Evelyn left on the floor, waited. The voice came, low, sizzling, like steam inside bone. "You're the only one who's not afraid to burn," he asked. "What do you want?" The voice said, "To finish what they started." He asked, "What did they start?" The voice replied, "They made ash without fire. I bring fire to make ash." Father Brown whispered, "Who are you?" And the voice answered, "The last one who wasn't believed." Then silence. He emerged trembling, his hands shaking, his stole blackened. The candle untouched. The chapel bells rang once, loud, unprompted. That evening the village doctor died. His house burned from the inside out. Again, no signs of ignition. Again, no fire damage to the exterior. Again, the ash. This time, in the shape of lips. That made six symbols, 6 sins, 6 denials, and each time, the confessional grew colder. Father Brown finally spoke to the townspeople. In the rain, on the church steps. He said, "We are not cursed. We are the curse. And the ash will not stop until we tell the truth to something older than God." He told them to come forward, to speak, to confess, not to man, but to what was listening in the dark. But no one did. That night, the confessional door vanished. It was gone, not broken, not removed, gone. And in its place, a burned line in the shape of a mouth, smiling. The final twist came in the form of a photograph, delivered to Father Brown's door. No note, just a photo of Evelyn, standing beside the original church choir. The date, 1963. But Evelyn had only just turned 15 this year. And in the photo, she was 15 then, which meant she had never aged, because she had never left, because she had never been found, because she had never stopped waiting, because her voice was still singing. Father Brown placed the photograph in the center of the confessional, closed what remained of the booth, lit a match, watched the flame flicker, and whispered, "I know who burned first, but I still don't know who struck the match." As he turned to leave, a breeze passed through the chapel for the first time in years, and behind him, the ashes rearranged themselves into a single word: soon. When asked later if he'd solved it, if he knew who did it, Father Brown simply said, "Yes, but the ashes have sworn me to silence." Chapter 6. A Sin Burned into Silence. The girl screamed her confession through the flames, but by the time the priest reached her, her tongue had already turned to ash. It happened in the rectory garden, at midnight, beneath a black sky, thick with smoke that no one else seemed to see. The fire had no source, no scent, no sound. It danced around her like a whisper, and vanished the moment Father Brown arrived, leaving nothing but scorched soil and silence. And in the center of it, where her body should have been, there was only a melted crucifix fused into a twisted silver knot, and her shadow burned into the grass. Her name was Mary Weatherby, 17, a student at St. Ignatius. She came to confession every Tuesday, always first, always shaking. Father Brown remembered her voice, thin, afraid, but determined. She never spoke for long. Her sins were never clear. But what haunted him was her question, always the same, every single week. If the sin belongs to someone else, am I still guilty for not stopping it? He had asked her once what she meant, and she had stared at him with wide eyes and said nothing, just made the sign of the cross and fled the booth like she was being chased. That was 3 weeks ago. Now she was gone. The next morning, Father Brown walked through the garden alone. The grass hadn't grown back. The shape of her was still seared into the earth. He knelt, touched the outline gently, and said a prayer. But no words came. Instead, he heard something, a soft, dry crackling, like the sound of pages burning far away. Then a whisper. One word. Witness. Inside the chapel, the candles refused to light. Inside the sacristy, every Bible had a single page missing. The same one. Luke 12:3. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light. No one had torn them. There were no scraps, no ash, just absence, like the words had decided to disappear. That same day, the town's archivist, Jonathan Hales, was found in his study with his hands covered in soot and his mouth sewn shut. Not stitched, burned closed, fused, his lips melted together. He survived, barely. But when he woke, he tried to speak and began to convulse. The machines monitoring him burst into static. The window shattered, and the lights died. His wife told Father Brown that Jonathan had been researching a forgotten chapter in the church's history. Something from 1955, something the diocese had tried to bury, something called the Whisper Doctrine. It wasn't in any official record, but there was a box, buried beneath the altar steps, sealed with wax. Father Brown broke it open and found only 2 things, a photograph and a burnt manuscript. The photo was of 7 priests standing around a bonfire at night. In the fire, barely visible, was a wooden confessional, burning, and someone was inside it, reaching, screaming. The manuscript was worse. Its title was smeared with soot, but legible. A Doctrine of Fire. How God destroys the tongue before it can damn the soul. The pages detailed a hidden belief, condemned by the Vatican, never spoken aloud in public. It claimed that some sins were so poisonous that to speak them, to even confess them, was to invite a second damnation. These sins, it said, must be consumed in silence, and those who tried to tell would burn. Not metaphorically, literally. Mary had tried to confess. Jonathan had tried to research. Both were silenced. And now, Father Brown felt it closing in. That night, he lit a candle in the chapel and sat in the confessional. He didn't wait for a penitent. He waited for the presence. The thing that had silenced Mary, the thing that had stitched Jonathan shut. He asked, out loud, "What do you want?" The candle flickered. A shadow passed behind the booth, and a voice answered. But it wasn't human. It wasn't even angry. It was calm, detached, cold. "Not what, who?" he asked again. "Who?" And the voice said, "The one who wrote the doctrine still lives." The next morning, Father Brown found a name scrawled in soot on the inside of the booth. Bishop Corwin, a man who had vanished in 1956 under scandal, presumed dead, but there were no death records, no grave, no last rites, just a disappearance. And that's when Father Brown realized something chilling. Every sin silenced in the village had a pattern, not in the sin itself, but in the attempt to reveal it. They were always confessions spoken too late, always made in desperation, always involving someone in the church, someone powerful, someone who had disappeared, but never left. He visited the oldest member of the parish, Agnes Fenley, a woman too frail to walk, too stubborn to die. She had been a choir girl in the 50s. She remembered Bishop Corwin. Her voice shook when she spoke his name. He said, God spoke to him in the flames, that we had to burn the words out before they burned us. Father Brown asked her, "What did he make you do?" And she cried. Long, painful sobs. "Burn the letters," she said. "The ones from the children." "The ones that told the truth?" He asked. "Where?" And she whispered, "Beneath the black bell." There was an old iron bell behind the church. It hadn't rung in 60 years. Rusted, cracked, forgotten. Father Brown dug beneath it with his bare hands. He found bones, small ones, and burned pages still faintly readable. Letters, dozens of them, from children to priests to the bishop, describing things they had seen, things that had happened to them, things that should have never been allowed inside a church. And everyone ended the same way. I tried to tell, but no one let me. Father Brown carried them to the chapel, laid them before the altar, lit a match, but the flames wouldn't take. The pages refused to burn, as if the sin inside them had already burned itself into silence. He returned to the confessional and found something waiting, a mouth-shaped scorch mark on the wood, fresh, still smoking, and in the priest's seat, ashes, human ashes. A DNA test would later confirm they belonged to Bishop Corwin. But how? There was no body, no crime, no trace, just the shape of where he had once sat. And yet someone had heard a voice through the booth the night before. Someone had gone to confess and been answered by him. The doctrine had not died. It had simply changed its form. Father Brown stared at the ash and whispered, "Why now?" And the booth replied with a single word, etched in smoke against the panel, because someone finally listened. He held a sermon the next day. No congregation, no communion, only silence. He said, "We think sins die with time, but the worst ones learn how to survive without being spoken." He closed the chapel that evening, locked the doors, sat inside the booth one last time, and confessed. We don't know what he said, but when morning came, he was still there, alive, silent, eyes open, mouth burned shut, and above his head, written in ash on the confessional ceiling, "The truth is forbidden fire." I asked him once, long after, in the hospital, using pen and paper, "Do you know who made the doctrine?" He wrote back, "Yes." I asked, "Will you tell?" He wrote, "I already did," but the sin burned the words before they left my tongue. Chapter 7. Father Brown heard a lie. The man who came to confess had been dead for 2 days, but Father Brown heard his voice clearly, whispering a sin that couldn't possibly be true. It was late, nearly midnight. The chapel was empty, save for the flicker of a single candle and the hush of rain tapping the stained glass windows. Father Brown had nodded off briefly in the sacristy, but something had stirred him awake. Something not quite a sound, more like a shift in the atmosphere. He returned to the confessional, unsure why, and that's when he heard the voice. Not loud, not distorted, a calm, familiar tone that said, "Forgive me, Father, for what I did to her eyes." Father Brown froze. The voice belonged to Samuel Knox, a quiet librarian, a widower, a man who'd taken communion just last Sunday and smiled warmly as he passed the aisle. But Knox had been found dead in his home that morning, hanged, alone, no note. His funeral was scheduled for Friday, and yet Father Brown had just heard him, confessing something no one had asked. He opened the booth slowly, empty, no shadow, no echo, just the scent of damp earth and incense. He checked the record book. Nothing. No visitor had come through the chapel doors since dusk. The rain was unbroken, no footprints on the floor, but the voice had said one more thing before vanishing into the darkness. She told me not to lie, but I did, and now she won't close her eyes. Father Brown didn't sleep, not even a moment. At sunrise, he visited the morgue. Samuel Knox's body was still there, cold, grey, but something had changed. His eyelids had been forced open. They were dry, paper-thin, as if something had been holding them that way. The coroner insisted it was a prank by vandals, but the security footage showed no one had entered, just a single flicker of light in the corridor, a pulse like static, like the moment before lightning strikes, and Knox's body had shifted, slightly, just enough for the tape to catch. By the time Father Brown returned to the chapel, the confessional had been disturbed. A white feather lay on the priest's seat. A page from a book, torn neatly at the edges, had been pinned to the wall. It was from Dante's Inferno, with a single line underlined, "The darkest places in hell are reserved for those who maintain their neutrality in times of moral crisis." And there, below the quote, scribbled in Knox's handwriting, "I lied." That evening, Father Brown spoke with Mary Lister, a teenage girl who had worked part-time at the library. Her eyes were distant, her voice fragile. She said, "Mr. Knox told me he once read a book he shouldn't have, that it knew things about people who hadn't been born yet, that it whispered how they would die if they broke their promise." Father Brown asked her what promise. She whispered, "To keep the story a secret." He asked her if she knew what the story was. She only said, "I think he changed the ending." That night, another voice came through the confessional, this one shakier, desperate. "I saw him bury something beneath the old archives. It looked like a doll, but it bled." Father Brown asked. "Who?" The voice said. "Knox." But it didn't have his hands. The next morning, Father Brown found a shovel. He went to the church's archives, unused for years. Beneath the rotted floorboards, he dug 6 feet down. The soil was dry, but the smell was foul. And then he found it, a box, locked tight, charred around the corners, and inside, a journal, handwritten, dated 10 years ago. The author, Samuel Knox. But the contents weren't from a librarian. They were from someone keeping track of names, of whispers, of truths, confessed and denied. Every entry described someone in the village, their sins, their secrets, their lies, and at the bottom of each page, a lie that was never caught until one page, marked only Mary. Father Brown read it once, then again, then closed the book and wept. Because it wasn't Mary Lister's name written, it was Mary Knox, his daughter, dead 20 years, drowned, but she had never drowned. The next day, Mary Lister disappeared. Her clothes were found folded neatly in the choir loft. Her necklace, a crucifix, was placed at the foot of the confessional. Inside it, folded tightly, was a single feather, matching the one found earlier. And beside the confessional door, scratched into the wood, were 4 words. Father Brown heard a lie. The investigation spiraled. The police reopened the Knox case. They found inconsistencies, gaps in the timeline, a second key to his flat in someone else's possession, a photo of Mary Knox, aged, recent, but blurred. Then came the big reveal. The voice on the chapel's audio surveillance, the one they thought was Knox, was analyzed. It wasn't a voice at all. It was a reconstruction, an amalgamation of other recordings, spliced together, deliberately, digitally, as if someone had wanted Father Brown to believe Knox was still alive, as if someone had wanted him to hear the lie and believe it, because the real lie was what the voice didn't say. Father Brown went back to the confessional. He sat inside. He waited. And at midnight, it came. A flicker, a breath, a whisper. This time, the voice wasn't Knox's. It was his own, repeating a line he didn't remember saying, "I forgive you for what you'll do." He staggered from the booth, heart pounding, confused, shaken, and then he saw it. A candle, lit, but no flame, just light, hovering, and beside it, Mary's crucifix, new, unscorched, untouched. Someone had returned it, someone who had never left. The final twist was simple. Knox hadn't lied in the confession. The lie had been told years ago by someone else, someone Mary had trusted, someone who had rewritten her death. And now, the truth was leaking back into the world, through whispers, through fire, through stories changed just slightly enough that the ending wouldn't be believed. Father Brown placed the journal beneath the altar, locked it, threw away the key, and never entered the confessional again, because he now understood. A lie, once heard by the wrong ear, becomes a prophecy. I asked him later, "Do you know who really lied?" He nodded, then whispered, "The truth wanted to be forgotten. But lies, they remember." Chapter 8. What burned behind that screen. The smoke didn't rise from the booth. It seeped out like breath, curling under the door, carrying with it the scent of scorched flesh and secrets too sacred to survive. Father Brown arrived at St. Cuthbert's 10 minutes after the fire was declared extinguished. The chapel stood unscathed. No flames reached the altar, no candles had fallen, but the confessional, just the priest's side, was a blackened husk. Not torched, hollowed. The walls weren't charred. They were melted inward, like something had burned its way out from within. Yet nothing around it had been touched. No scorch marks, no heat damage. The crucifix above the booth remained white, clean, untouched, as if it had turned away. What was more impossible, there was no body, but there had been someone inside. Multiple parishioners had seen him enter. A man in a long coat, trembling, pacing the pews, finally stepping into the confessional like he was, stepping into his grave. They remembered his face, pale, raw with panic, a man on the edge. They remembered hearing his voice, low, muffled, frantic, as if racing against something. And then, silence. A thick, sudden silence that stretched for 20 minutes until smoke hissed through the booth's seams and someone screamed. The fire brigade found nothing. No trace of clothing, no bones, no blood. But in the black dust that clung to the booth's inner walls, Father Brown saw something no one else did. A single word, etched with the tip of a fingernail before the flames took hold. Lied. The bishop tried to dismiss it. A tragic suicide. Or hallucination. Likely just a chemical spark in the wood. But Father Brown knew wood. He knew fire. And he knew what despair looked like. This wasn't suicide. This was punishment. Ritual. A reckoning delivered behind the screen, meant to hide sin. And he recognized the handwriting. It belonged to a man named Ethan Carrick, a former seminarian, brilliant, withdrawn, obsessed with absolution. He had vanished 3 years ago on the eve of his ordination. No note, no trail. The church quietly erased him from the records. But Father Brown never forgot. Ethan had confessed once, long ago, not to a crime, but to a fear. He had said, "I think something hears us when we confess, Father. Not God, something older, something that doesn't forgive." That memory returned now, like a knife through smoke. Father Brown spent that night in silence. The next morning, he returned to the ruins of the booth. When he stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Not a metaphorical chill, a real, physical cold that raised gooseflesh beneath his cassock. And then he heard it. 3 knocks. From behind the screen, no one was there. Just the charred lattice, the air thick with the residue of a scream that had been swallowed, and then a whisper, his own name. Not spoken, hissed, inhaled. He staggered back. The side of his hand, which had touched the screen, was darkened with ash. But not just ash, shapes, letters. 5 lines had burned into his skin, faint as bruises, in old Latin script. He transcribed it, translated it. The phrase was simple and terrifying. The fire waits for the unsaid. That was the moment Father Brown stopped calling it an accident. He began visiting old churches, chapels with forgotten booths, places where the paint had peeled and the stones remembered things no one dared repeat. And everywhere he went, he found it. Burn marks, ash in the shape of hands, broken latches on the priest's side, and silence, heavy, watchful silence, as if the wood itself was listening, remembering. Then came the first real clue. A woman named Abigail Trent arrived at the chapel, asking to speak privately. She was shaking, wide-eyed. She had once been a student of Carrick's, back when he still taught theology. She said he'd written to her once after disappearing. The letter arrived soaked in some dark fluid. It smelled of iron and smoke. It contained only one sentence. What I said in the booth wasn't my sin. It was someone else's, and it followed me. Abigail had never spoken of it. Until now, because for the past week she had been waking up to the smell of fire. With no fire in her home, with ash on her pillow. Father Brown asked her what Ethan had been investigating before he vanished. She pulled out a journal, his journal. Its final entry read, "There is a flaw in confession. We assume we're alone with God, but something else is there, something that waits for borrowed guilt, something that devours second-hand sin." Father Brown closed the journal slowly. He remembered a strange case from his youth, a woman who died after confessing her husband's crimes, not because she was guilty, but because the guilt had chosen her. That night, he returned to the booth. He sat in the priest's side. He waited. The wood creaked behind the screen. No one entered, but he smelled smoke. Then, without warning, the screen glowed red for a single second, and an image flared across it, not visible to the eye, but burned into his thoughts like a dream you know isn't yours. A girl, blindfolded, kneeling, whispering a name he didn't recognize. Milo. The next day, he visited the diocesan archives. He asked for every confession-related incident that ended in fire. There were too many, from different parishes, different decades, but they all shared something in common. Each fire had started behind the screen. Each booth burned only on the priest's side. And in every case, the confessor had been speaking about someone else's sin. Father Brown felt it settle in his chest, like weight. There was something wrong with the act of taking on another's darkness. Something was keeping score, and it was punishing those who spoke guilt that wasn't theirs. He asked himself a question he'd never dared before. Does confession cleanse the soul or transfer the stain? He realized the screen wasn't just a divider. It was a membrane, thin, porous, and now it was bleeding. Then came the first big reveal, a hidden room beneath the chapel, sealed decades ago. Inside, dozens of priest stoles, burned, charred, some reduced to black thread, and on the wall, painted in soot, an icon, a mouth, not open, swallowing, and beside it, a ledger. Every name written in it had died in a confessional fire, including Ethan Carrick, including priests Father Brown had known. Some of them listed after they were declared missing, but none had confessed their own sins. Each entry recorded someone else's guilt, and in red ink, beside each one, a phrase, not the original bearer. Father Brown returned to the confessional. He removed the screen. Behind it was something he had never seen before. Not just wood, not just darkness, but layers of old paper, melted into the grain. Letters, pages of confessions, charred but readable. Confessions from people who were never there. Words written by others and whispered through someone else, like a virus. Father Brown sat, and for the first time, he confessed a sin that was truly his, a lie he told 20 years ago. No fire, no heat, just cold. And then a voice replied, not from behind, but inside him. You are safe, because the fire knows who you are. But then it added, next time, don't listen for someone else's truth. It already has a mouth. The booth creaked. A feather fell. burned on the edges. And Father Brown understood. What burned behind that screen wasn't just a man. It was belief twisted. It was truth borrowed. It was guilt spoken too late by the wrong lips. He stepped out of the booth, locked it, hung his stole on the doorknob, and never wore it again, because some things aren't ours to hear, and some flames never go out. When asked later if he knew what had burned Ethan Carrick alive, Father Brown said, "Yes, but it wasn't hellfire. It was something colder. It was the silence between someone else's sin and the moment you believe it's yours." Chapter 9. Ashes spoke before he died. They swept the ashes into an urn, but before they sealed it, a voice whispered from inside, "He didn't kill himself." No one believed it at first. No one could. It was absurd, impossible, blasphemous. But every person in that room, the mortician, the priest, the grieving brother, froze when they heard it. A voice, faint, rasped, unmistakably real. It echoed once and was gone. Not a sound from outside. Not the groan of old wood. A sentence. Spoken, intelligent, and full of warning. Father Brown had never seen a room fall so silent, not from reverence, but from absolute mind-shattering fear. The man they were cremating was Francis Bell, 48, a well-liked schoolteacher, quiet, respected, devout. They found him in his study 3 nights before, his hands folded on the desk, a letter by his side. It read like a suicide note, confession, regret, apology. But something about the ink had bothered Father Brown when he first read it. It was smudged at the start, like the pen hesitated, and the handwriting changed slightly halfway through. But no one wanted to hear doubts. The family needed closure. The village needed silence. They burned him the next morning, and then the ashes spoke. Father Brown was the only one who didn't leave the room. The mortician fainted. The brother ran. But Father Brown stayed. He bent down, touched the edge of the urn. It was cold, colder than steel. And around the rim, though no one could explain it, was a blackened fingerprint. Not Francis's, someone else's, burned into the ceramic like a brand. He didn't tell anyone what the voice had said. Not yet. He needed to understand it first. That night, the ashes were stored in the chapel's crypt for safekeeping until the memorial. And when Father Brown went to lock the chamber, he noticed something peculiar. A trail of soot, thin, scattered, leading from the urn to the far wall, like something had tried to escape or had already left. He followed it. It led him to the confessional. Of course it did. But the door was already open, and inside, someone had drawn a shape in the dust on the seat. Not a cross, not a word, an eye, blinking, wide, watching. He sat down, just for a moment, and the booth creaked. He felt something shift in the air behind the screen. Not a breeze, a presence, something pressing. Back, not warm, not cold, just there. Then the whisper returned. This time, not a voice, a hiss, a sound that rose like breath through flame. Witness. He left the booth, trembling. The next morning, Francis's brother came to him, pale and sweating. He said he had found something strange in Francis's study, a charred scrap of paper beneath the floorboard, burned but not destroyed. On it, a single phrase repeated again and again in tiny, desperate handwriting. The fire won't lie. The fire won't lie. The fire won't lie. Father Brown went to the study himself. The floorboard lifted easily. The wood was darkened underneath, as if it had already been set alight once. And deeper still, wedged between the joists, was something far more disturbing. A tooth, still bloody, still warm, with no explanation of how it could have survived the fire, or why it pulsed slightly in his palm as he held it. He wrapped it in cloth, took it to the church, placed it on the altar, and prayed. The candle beside it sparked, then died, and then relit on its own. He knew then. Francis hadn't killed himself. He hadn't even written that note. Something had made it look that way. But what terrified Father Brown most wasn't the idea that someone had murdered Francis. It was the idea that Francis had died for something he hadn't even done. That night, the ashes moved again. He found them spilled along the chapel tiles, this time forming a word. Why? He stayed awake, watching them for hours. They didn't move again, but in the silence, he could feel it. A truth trying to claw its way back through the smoke. He returned to Francis's school, spoke to his students, his colleagues. One girl said something strange. He used to sit at his desk after class and talk to someone who wasn't there, like not crazy talking, like he knew who it was, like they were listening. Father Brown asked her, "What did he say?" She hesitated. He said, "I told them what I saw. That should be enough, right?" Father Brown asked, "Did he ever say what he saw?" She nodded. "Once, he whispered it really soft. I almost didn't hear it. He said, 'I saw them turn to ash before they ever caught fire.'" And that was the moment Father Brown realized. Francis Bell had witnessed something that couldn't be seen, something that burned not bodies, but evidence, something that erased guilt through combustion, something that made people look guilty by incinerating everything that could have saved them. Francis had tried to tell, and someone or something had stopped him. He returned to the confessional, sat again, and for the first time, he spoke aloud. "What did you see?" And the voice replied, not as Francis, but as someone older, deeper, a tone that wasn't human. "I watched them rewrite justice with fire, and I marked the liar with ash." Father Brown asked, "Who lied?" And the whisper said, "The one who mourns loudest." He remembered Francis's brother, wailing at the funeral, screaming in the crypt. But something had been off. He had insisted on cremation. Quickly, quietly. He had cleaned the study before the police arrived. He had spoken of Francis in past tense before he was officially declared dead. Father Brown returned to the brothers' house. The chimney was cold, but full of soot, and in it, half-burned pages of an old diary, Francis's handwriting, pages torn out, destroyed, but not all of them. One sentence survived. "He killed them and blamed me. And when I told the truth, he said the fire would forgive us both." There had been other victims, not just Francis, 2 children, a nun, a vagrant, all linked by location, by time, but never by suspect. Now they were connected by flame, and Francis had seen it, had tried to speak, and the fire had found him. Father Brown confronted the brother. No accusations, just one question. "What did the ashes say to you before you sealed the urn?" The brother paled, his lip quivered, and then he ran. They found him 2 hours later, in his garden, burned alive, nothing else touched, just his body. Ashes, smoking, and beside him, a single word, burned into the soil: justice. Father Brown attended no more funerals that year. He no longer entered the confessional. The urn was sealed, but sometimes, when he walked the chapel alone, he'd hear a faint crackle behind the altar, and smell fire, but never see light, only smoke, and inside it, shapes, mouths, eyes, tongues that had burned before they could tell the truth. When asked later, in a rare interview, whether he knew what the ashes meant when they spoke before Francis died, Father Brown only said, yes. But truth spoken too late is still a lie. Ashishur chapter 10. The killer entered through faith. The man who murdered 4 people in Kembleford was first baptized by Father Brown, and his confession began with the words, "I only kill believers." There had been no reason to suspect him. He attended Mass every Sunday. He kissed the crucifix with trembling reverence. He lit candles for the dead, knelt longer than anyone else, and whispered prayers that made even the most devout parishioners uneasy, not because of what he said, but because of how still the church became around him when he spoke. The air would go cold, the light dim. Even the birds outside the stained glass windows fell silent. No one noticed, no one asked. But Father Brown felt it. Something wrong was kneeling among the faithful. The first victim was Evelyn Mayer, the organist. She was found on the chapel balcony, folded neatly beneath the pipes, her eyes open, lips sewn shut with silver thread. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, only a single note left on the pew below. Her voice was meant to rise, not reveal. The police were baffled. There was no motive, no witnesses. Father Brown spoke at her funeral. He didn't mention the note, not yet. Then came Bernard Holt, the groundskeeper. A quiet man, rarely seen indoors, but known for tending the graves as though he were speaking with the dead. They found him buried alive beneath the newly dug plot of a child who had never been born. When they unearthed him, he was clasping a crucifix so tightly it had embedded into his chest. In his pocket was a piece of parchment burned around the edges, on which someone had written in Latin, "Those who sanctify the earth must answer to what sleeps beneath it." Father Brown felt it growing, an invisible rot spreading beneath the surface of the village, slow and methodical, like a hand moving chess pieces only it could see. The deaths weren't random. They were ritualistic, personal, and somehow still unseen by everyone else. But then it became impossible to ignore. Sister Agnes disappeared on a Sunday morning, just before the Eucharist. She had been in the sacristy preparing the vessels for the Mass. The door was closed, locked from within. But when they broke it down, she was gone. No blood, no sign of struggle, only her rosary beads, still warm, laid out on the cloth in the shape of an eye, and beneath them a single drop of red wax. Father Brown touched it. It burned his finger, though it hadn't been near any candle. That night, the confessional caught fire. Again. Only this time, it didn't burn wood. It burned silence. Inside the booth, scorched into the screen with surgical precision, were the words, "Faith, open the door." The next morning, a man came to confess. He wore a long black coat, pale face, cold eyes. He entered the chapel with reverence, dipped his fingers in holy water, made the sign of the cross, and then walked into the confessional. Father Brown took his place on the other side. The man didn't speak for 30 seconds. Then he said, "You baptized me, Father. You placed your hand on my head and welcomed me into a family I never asked for. And now I return the gift by cleaning the altar of liars." Father Brown said nothing. The voice continued, "They called it faith, but it was fear, and fear makes a perfect invitation." Father Brown finally asked, "Invitation to what?" The voice replied, to something that listens when prayers go unanswered. That was when he knew. This wasn't madness. This wasn't revenge. This was belief, turned inward, like a blade. He tried to ask the man's name, but the booth had gone silent. When he stepped out, the other side was empty. No door creak, no footsteps, no echo, only a faint scent of myrrh and smoke. That night, Father Brown searched the baptismal records from 15 years ago. He found it. A boy, James Carow, born in Kembleford, orphaned, baptized at St. Mary's by Father Brown himself, fostered by 3 different families, each of whom left the village under strange circumstances. One was struck by lightning, another burned in a fire, the third disappeared on a pilgrimage and never returned. Carow had vanished at 13. No obituary, no death, just a final line. In the record book, confirmed in silence. Father Brown sat in the chapel alone for hours. He didn't pray. He listened, because now the killer had confessed, but not for forgiveness, for entry. 2 days later, a man named Patrick Flynn, a visiting scholar from London, was found dead in the bell tower. His body wasn't torn or bloodied, but his eyes had been replaced with tiny communion wafers. And burned onto the floor beside him, in a circle of wax and ash, was a symbol, an open door with no hinges, and in his journal, a sentence Father Brown recognized. The killer entered through faith. Father Brown didn't speak at that funeral. He stood at the back of the crowd, watching, waiting, and then, as the casket was lowered, he saw him, James Carow, alive, smiling, dressed in black, standing beneath the tree at the edge of the graveyard. No one else seemed to notice him. No one turned, but Father Brown's breath caught, and Carow winked. Later that evening, a letter was found on the altar, unmarked, unsigned, but sealed in black wax with no crest. Inside, there is no weapon greater than belief, Father, no mask stronger than devotion. You gave me the key when you baptized me. You invited me in when you whispered salvation. You made me real. So now I offer you the same gift. Speak my name, and I vanish. But do not speak it, and I'll leave you untouched. For now. Father Brown burned the letter without a word. He returned to the rectory, sat in the dark, whispered a name no one else had heard in 15 years, then crossed it out, because something had changed. The killer no longer needed to enter through faith. He had already built a home inside it. And even Father Brown couldn't tell the difference anymore. When asked by the diocese whether he believed the deaths were supernatural, Father Brown replied, "No, but I believe in what faith invites when we forget to question who's knocking." Chapter 11. Father Brown can't absolve murder. The man knelt in the confessional, dripping blood through the screen, and whispered, "I killed her, Father, and I need you to forgive me before they find the body." Father Brown didn't speak. He didn't move. Something about the voice, low, shaking, too calm, froze him. He'd heard every kind of confession in his years of priesthood, but never one like this. There was no guilt in the man's tone, no regret, only urgency, as if forgiveness was nothing more than a passport he needed to escape. The chapel was dark, except for one flickering candle behind the altar, and the booth felt smaller than usual, like the shadows were closing in. On the other side of the screen, the man's breathing was shallow, deliberate. And then he added something that made Father Brown's blood run cold. She's still warm, Father. I made sure of that before I came here. The door to the church had been locked. No one had seen him enter. No name was given. But when Father Brown tried to press for details, who was she? Why? The voice simply said, "That's not why I'm here. I don't need to explain. I need absolution. But absolution is not a transaction, and murder is not a sin easily wrapped in prayer." Father Brown refused, softly but firmly. "I can listen, I can pray, but I cannot absolve you. Not if you came here to escape, not if you have no intention to repent." The booth went quiet for too long. Then a slow inhale. "I thought you might say that," the man whispered. "That's why I left her where you could find her." The confessional door slammed. Footsteps echoed down the aisle. By the time Father Brown emerged, the chapel was empty. She was found 15 minutes later, in the garden behind the rectory, laid out gently, no sign of struggle. Her eyes closed, her hands folded like she'd been preparing for her own funeral. A young woman, unknown to the parish, no ID, nothing to name her except a small silver cross clutched in her palm, identical to the one Father Brown wore under his vestments. On her chest was a note, written in red ink. "He can't forgive what he won't remember." The investigation began immediately. The police questioned everyone in the village. No one knew her or claimed to. But there was something else. Something Father Brown didn't tell them. He had seen her before, 2 nights prior, standing at the edge of the cemetery during evening mass, watching him, pale, silent, dressed in black. She had disappeared before he could speak to her. But now, here she was, dead, and somehow placed in a position that implied trust. But why? Father Brown began searching for answers the only way he knew how. Through the confessional records. Not the written ones, they don't exist. But his memories. A year ago, someone had confessed to him in that same booth, in that same voice. A man. A voice that trembled, but not from fear, from excitement. A voice that said, "I think I'm going to hurt someone, Father, but I'll feel better after I do. If I confess now, is it still a sin later?" He had dismissed it at the time, a disturbed soul, a cry for help. But what if it wasn't hypothetical? What if that was the beginning? And what if this was the end? The problem was, without a name, without a face, there was nothing to track. The police had no leads. The woman's body bore no fingerprints, no bruises, no blood, despite the man saying he was bleeding. Nothing except the note. And that was the second thing Father Brown didn't tell the police. He had seen that handwriting before, in a letter sent to him anonymously 6 months ago. A letter that read, "You won't remember me now, but you will when I need you to." He still had the letter. It was burned around the edges. Ashes had fallen out of the envelope when he opened it. He kept it hidden in his study. It didn't feel threatening then. Just strange. Now, it felt like a countdown. The next night, another message appeared, this time carved into the church's front door. Deep. Careful. Not rushed. You chose her. Father Brown didn't sleep. He sat at the altar, candlelight casting trembling shadows across the pews. And then, at exactly 3:03 a.m., he heard the door creak open, though it had been locked. Footsteps, slow, measured, someone walking barefoot on stone. He turned. No one was there, but when he returned to the confessional, he found the seat cold, and a second note, pinned to the wood, One murder, Father. One silence. One truth you buried for God. And he remembered a case years ago. A woman named Marianne Leach had accused a deacon of violence. Father Brown had believed her. He'd tried to protect her, but the diocese had intervened, silenced the case, moved the deacon. Marianne had vanished shortly after, presumed dead. No body was found, but the cross in the dead woman's hand, the one found behind the rectory, was identical to the one Marianne used to wear. What if she hadn't died? What if she'd gone underground? What if the man who confessed wasn't her killer, but her son, raised in secret, fed on vengeance, raised in the ruins of forgiveness, denied? Suddenly, the words made sense. He can't forgive what he won't remember. Father Brown had buried the truth, not to protect evil, but to preserve peace. And now that silence had birthed a murderer. Then came the final, devastating revelation. In the confessional, beneath the kneeler, was an envelope. Inside it, a photograph. Father Brown, 20 years ago, holding a newborn. In his arms, the mother standing beside him, Marianne. The boy in the photo had dark eyes, cold, like the man who had confessed. On the back of the photo, one sentence: "You baptized me too, Father, and you forgot." And suddenly, Father Brown understood. This wasn't about the murder. This was about memory. This was about a forgotten moment that created a monster. This was about a soul that had grown up waiting to be acknowledged. And when it wasn't, it built its own theology, where pain became penance, where forgiveness was a myth, where murder was a message. He returned to the booth one last time, sat in silence, lit a candle, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I remember now." And the booth whispered back, "Then you understand why I can't stop." Father Brown didn't move. He felt the fire without heat. He felt the guilt he thought he'd left behind. And then, like breath against his ear, "You can't absolve murder, Father, because you committed the first one." He opened his eyes. The candle had gone out, and across the screen, something had been carved. Judgment never needed forgiveness. When asked by the authorities whether he recognized the man who confessed, Father Brown simply said, "Yes, but he didn't come for forgiveness. He came to remind me what I forgot." And then he added quietly, "And I will never forget again." Chapter 12. Smoke rose before blood fell. The blood was still pumping when the first wisp of smoke curled from the floorboards, meaning the fire didn't come after the murder. It came before. Father Brown stood at the edge of the nave, staring at the trail of smoke that drifted upward from beneath the altar. It wasn't fire. Not yet. It didn't burn. It whispered. It moved like memory. And when the scream came, sharp, wet, final, he knew the order of events had been reversed. Something ancient had been set in motion. And the murder wasn't a cause. It was a consequence. The victim was Henry Wilton, parish councilman, patron of the chapel's renovation fund. Publicly devout, privately distant, he had come into the church alone that morning, as he did every Sunday before the rest arrived, to kneel in silence before the statue of St. Jude and light a candle. The same candle, the same flame, the same routine. But this time, when the smoke began rising, he didn't move. Witnesses later said he simply stared at the floor, as if something beneath it were breathing. Then he clutched his chest, not from pain, but from sudden clarity. Then he fell, face forward, blood from his mouth, no wound, no violence, just the stillness of someone who had been claimed. It wasn't natural. The coroner would say heart failure, but Father Brown knew better, because just before Henry died, the smoke shaped itself into a hand, and it pointed toward the confessional. The church was evacuated. Investigators arrived. They swept the building. No accelerants, no heat damage, no source, but still, the smoke lingered. And behind the altar, hidden under a loose stone slab, they found it. A metal box, sealed with wax and bound with string. Inside, ashes, not wood, not cloth, bone, crushed, and wrapped in paper, bearing one line, "I died, waiting for someone to speak." Father Brown didn't recognize the ye handwriting, but he recognized the message. 20 years ago, a woman named Teresa Dunley had gone missing from the village, vanished without trace. She was 17, an orphan. She used to clean the chapel every Thursday. No one looked too hard when she disappeared. No family, no property, just silence. But Father Brown had always suspected. Not murder, not escape, suppression. She had once confessed something to him, something so strange, so fragmented, it barely made sense. She said, "Sometimes the saints cry when I touch them. I think they know what I saw under the floor." He had asked her what she meant. She had simply said, "Smoke goes down before it goes up." And then she never came back. Now, standing over the ashes, her ashes, he was sure of it. Father Brown felt the old guilt clawing at him. The guilt of not digging deeper, of not listening when she whispered truth dressed as madness. But the truth wasn't finished yet. That night, he stayed in the chapel, alone, watching. At precisely 2:12 a.m., the confessional door opened. No one touched it. No wind blew. It simply swung open, and out from it, more smoke. Just one curl, but enough to make the candle flicker. He walked over, knelt, entered the priest's side, and sat. The screen glowed faintly red, and then he heard the breath. Not a voice. A breath. Human. Near. And then, she said the wrong name. That's why she died. He froze. "What name?" he whispered. She accused the wrong man, and the right one kept quiet. A pause, and so did you. The next day, he reopened the case, dug through records, letters, gossip buried in the walls of the village, and he found it. A witness statement never submitted. A child, 8 years old at the time, who had seen Teresa leave the chapel the night she vanished. She hadn't been alone. She'd been with Henry Wilton, the man who had just died. But the child's statement had been torn up, and the priest who had taken it reassigned the next week. No mention in the diocesan archives, no forwarding address, no trace, except for one journal entry Father Brown uncovered in an old drawer, yellowed and brittle. She said it was Wilton. She said it loudly, but he wasn't alone. There was another in the confessional, hiding, watching, writing. And then a final line. Smoke rose before blood fell. The same words carved into the floor beneath the altar. The same pattern, repeating. Teresa had spoken. She'd named someone, Wilton, but someone else had heard, and that someone had silenced her. And now, 20 years later, that someone had returned to watch Wilton die, to make sure the silence held. Father Brown didn't know who it was, but he felt their presence, not metaphorically, truly. The church had gone cold. The candles hissed when lit. The bells rang without being touched. And Every time he entered the confessional, a single feather, blackened, lay on the seat. He prayed, he wept, he searched. And then the final piece came to him, an old letter, unopened, sent to him 5 years ago, from someone named L. Hartwell. He never remembered receiving it, but it had his name, his handwriting on the return envelope. Inside, only one sentence. If the girl burns, the priest can't be trusted. He thought about it, replayed it. If the girl burns, present tense. Had Teresa ever really died? Or had she been burned in effigy, publicly disappeared, privately erased? He found the answer in the church's bell tower, beneath the rope, behind the wall, a second confessional, hidden, sealed, unmarked. Inside it, bone dust, and a diary, written in Teresa's hand. Last dated entry. He prays while I scream. He asks for absolution while he locks the door. And he tells me, if I tell, no one will believe me. He's right. I didn't. Father Brown couldn't breathe. The priest before him, the one who took her confession, he hadn't reassigned himself. He had stayed. He had killed her. He had burned her voice into ash. And now, someone new. Someone had come back. Someone who had waited, learned, and orchestrated Wilton's death to expose the rest. But not for justice, for balance. And that someone had confessed. In that booth, with breath like smoke. So Father Brown went back, sat, lit the candle, and asked the air, "Is it done?" The booth was quiet, and then, "No. There are still 2 names, one buried, one burning." He whispered, "Whose?" But the booth creaked, and the voice said, "You'll know, when the blood hits the steps." Father Brown waited 3 days. Then, during Sunday Mass, a man collapsed while reading the Gospel. Blood pooled from his mouth. But he hadn't been touched. He had been hollowed, like Wilton. And in his hand, a match, unused, and under his tongue, a scrap of paper. 3 words, "He still forgives." And when Father Brown looked to the altar, smoke rose. No fire, no heat, just the same silent warning. The cycle wasn't over, it had only begun. When asked, years later, whether he ever discovered who had orchestrated it all, Father Brown said softly, "Yes, but smoke speaks in riddles. And I chose to listen, instead of accuse." Then he turned to the confessional, eyes hollow, and whispered, "Some justice arrives long after the blood, but always before the truth."